I keep the recording in my quarters, though I'm not supposed to. 3 minutes and 47 seconds of static-laced audio that cost 40,000 lives to answer. Sometimes, late in the cycle when the lumen strips dim to their rest setting and the vents rattle out their last recycled breaths before the midnight maintenance silence, I play it back. Not because I enjoy it, the Emperor knows I don't, but because I need to remember. We all need to remember, those of us who were there, what happens when you mistake endurance for weakness. The voice on the recording is young, 19, maybe 20 standard years, male, educated in the way that hive nobility educate their children, tutors and recitators, proper high Gothic pronunciation, the kind of refinement that comes from never having missed a meal. His name was Sebastian Volk, youngest son of a merchant dynasty with 3 generations of administratum connections and a bloodline that could be traced back to the original settlement charters. He'd been studying for the priesthood before the rot took him, before they all turned. Is anyone even listening? The recording crackles with his amusement. I suppose the Emperor's trained dogs are still licking their wounds in orbit. Too afraid to come down and face us? Too afraid to face the truth we've seen? The real powers don't need your pathetic drill formations and the mockery spirals on, each word more poisonous than the last, laughter echoing from his co-conspirators in the background. They were broadcasting on every frequency they could reach, jamming prayer hours and official channels, forcing every Imperial soul within 3 sectors to hear their contempt. I was there, in the stratagem aboard the Times Absolute Mandate *, when Fleet Captain Corvessa shut it off midstream. The silence that followed stretched like a held breath. Around the hololith table, 17 guard officers stood perfectly still, their faces betraying nothing. I remember thinking how strange that was that they should remain so calm when I, a mere munitorum coordinator assigned to track supply requisitions, felt my hands shaking with rage at the heresy pouring through our vox speakers. Colonel Hennick of the Kolvar 88th broke the silence. Munitorum. His voice had the texture of spent gravel, worn smooth by 30 years of issuing orders. What's our deployment capacity? I consulted my data slate, fingers still trembling slightly. 4 regiments groundside within 18 hours, sir. 8 more within 48, if we expedite the loading cycles. Full complement of armor, artillery, and air support within 72 hours. The Departamento Munitorum has already allocated. No. He cut me off with a single word. Everything. I want every regiment in this sector prepared for deployment. I want every shell, every lasgun power pack, every ration tin catalogued and loaded. I want the full strength of the Imperial Guard brought to bear on Volhemia Tertius. I must have looked uncertain, because Fleet Captain Corvessa's adjutant, a woman with burn scars crawling up her neck from some forgotten engagement, leaned forward. That's 14 regiments, Colonel. For a single hive city uprising? Our intelligence suggests no more than 10,000 rebels, mostly PDF turncoats with stolen equipment. 4 regiments would be more than. They mocked us. Hennick's interruption was quiet, but something in his tone made the strategium feel suddenly colder. They called us dogs. They laughed while broadcasting their heresy across channels meant for the Emperor's word. We will deploy 14 regiments. We will deploy every asset available, and we will ensure that when the Adeptus Ministorum records this campaign in their archives, it will serve as a permanent reminder of what happens when you underestimate the Imperial Guard. That was the first time I truly understood. Not the Guard's capabilities. I'd memorized the tactical doctrines, read the engagement reports, studied the casualty ratios from 1,000 campaigns. No. What I understood then, watching Hennick's weathered face remain perfectly impassive as he condemned an entire hive city to systematic destruction, was the Guard's nature. They weren't angry. They weren't insulted in the way a nobleman might be when questioned by a serf. They were simply going to do what they always did, their duty. And their duty, as defined by Hennick in that moment, was to answer mockery with such overwhelming force that no one would ever make that mistake again. The first wave landed 21 hours later. I went down with the third wave. embedded with the Munitorum Logistics Command that would coordinate the endless stream of supplies required to keep 14 regiments fighting. From orbit, Volhemia Tertius had looked like any other hive city, a tumor of rockcrete and steel sprawling across 300 square kilometers, its upper spires gleaming in the planetary dawn, while its underhive festered in perpetual twilight. By the time my transport touched down at the secured landing zone, the first guard units had already established a perimeter around the entire city's base, a ring of armored positions and artillery emplacements that stretched horizon to horizon. The heretics were still broadcasting. Sebastian Volk's voice, or others like it, crackled across the Vox with the same mocking confidence. Still hiding behind your big guns, still too afraid to face us street by street. We've claimed this city in the name of powers you can't comprehend. Your emperor is a corpse, and your guard are corpse worshippers playing soldier in the ruins of a dead dream. I expected immediate assault. Thunderous artillery bombardment, infantry charges, the swift, brutal shock that guard doctrine typically employed against urban resistance. Instead, Colonel Hennick gave a different order. Cordon and contain. No one leaves, no one enters. Establish forward observation posts. Mark every entrance, every exit, every ventilation shaft, every sewer outlet. I want the entire city mapped and monitored. For 3 days, nothing happened. The heretics continued their broadcasts, their mockery growing more elaborate as they interpreted the guards' patience as hesitation. They described elaborate rituals they'd performed, the blessings they'd received, the promises their new gods had made. Some of it was obviously exaggerated, the desperate bravado of people trying to convince themselves they'd made the right choice. But some of it, the parts where their voices dropped to reverent whispers, where background screams occasionally punctuated their words, some of it was sickeningly genuine. I spent those 3 days in a prefabricated Munitorum command post, processing requisition requests and monitoring supply lines. The sheer volume of materiel flowing into our staging areas was staggering. Shells by the tens of thousands, each one catalogued and distributed to artillery batteries that sat in their reinforced positions, barrels aimed at the city but remaining silent. Ration packs by the hundreds of thousands, enough to feed an army for months. Medical supplies, fuel, spare parts, ammunition, everything carefully inventoried, organized, prepared. On the 4th day, the heretics made their first sortie. 3,000 of them, armed with looted PDF equipment and whatever improvised weapons they'd cobbled together, came screaming out of the southern gates in a desperate charge. They'd painted symbols on their skin, symbols I recognized from the most basic anti-corruption training every Imperial servant received. They believed those symbols would protect them. They believed their new gods were watching, would reward their courage, would grant them victory over the Emperor's dogs. I watched from an observation tower as they crossed the open ground toward the guards' positions. The sound of their charge carried even at distance wordless screams, prayers to foul entities, the kind of manic desperation that comes from knowing, deep down, that you've made a terrible mistake, but being unable to admit it. They covered perhaps 200 meters before the guard responded, not with the roaring fury you might expect, not with the explosive violence of warriors defending their honor. The guard's response was measured, calculated, professional. Artillery opened up first, ranging shots that fell among the charging heretics with clockwork precision, then fire, entire platoons shooting in coordinated volleys, the snap-crack of las weapons merging into a sustained hiss like some massive serpent drawing breath. Heavy bolters added their rhythmic thunder, autocannons their heavier percussion. The heretics died by the hundreds. Those who made it close enough to see the guard positions, clearly close enough to see the soldiers manning those positions, faces obscured by rebreathers and helmets, postures relaxed and ready. Those fortunate few at the front line probably realized their mistake in those final seconds. The guard weren't hiding, weren't afraid, weren't even particularly concerned. They were simply doing their job with the same methodical competence they brought to everything else. When it was over, when the last heretic had fallen and the guns had gone silent, I counted perhaps 12 minutes of actual combat. 12 minutes to annihilate 3,000 enemy combatants. The Guard casualties, as reported through my data channels: 4 wounded, 1 seriously when a stray stubber round found a gap in his flak armor, 3,000 dead for 4 wounded. The mathematics were almost obscene in their efficiency. The broadcasts stopped after that. For 6 hours, the Vox channels remained silent, except for standard Imperial traffic. I allowed myself to hope, briefly, that the heretics had learned, that they would surrender, throw themselves on the Emperor's mercy, accept whatever punishment the commissariat deemed appropriate. It would still be terrible mass executions, servitor conversion for the lucky ones, but it would be over. Then Sebastian Volk came back on the air. His voice had changed. The educated refinement had cracked, revealing something desperate underneath. "You think that matters? You think we care about those faithful who transcended to join the gods? You're still too afraid to come in here. You're still sitting outside like patient dogs waiting for their master's word. Come inside, if you dare. Come see what we've built. Come see what awaits the servants of a dead." The broadcast cut off mid-word. Not jammed, I would have recognized the distinctive static of Vox interference. This was deliberate. Someone on the heretic end choosing to end the transmission. I learned later that their chaos-corrupted leadership had realized what Volk hadn't, that every word of mockery, every taunt, every insult was simply adding to the final tally. The Guard would remember every syllable, would account for each one in the reckoning to come. Colonel Hennick's next briefing was short. "Logistics confirms we have sufficient supplies to maintain current deployments for 4 months without resupply. All artillery batteries are to begin coordinated bombardment of designated sectors. Infantry regiments will advance following the standard urban assault pattern: clear, hold, advance. No heroics, no rush. We proceed by the manual, 1 sector at a time. The enemy has fortified the hive. We will reduce it to rubble and dig them out of the ruins." That was when I began to understand what the 3-day delay had really meant. The Guard hadn't been hesitating or preparing psychologically or gathering courage. They'd been mapping. Every building, every intersection, every possible strong point had been identified, classified, and assigned a target priority. The heretics had spent those 3 days fortifying positions that were already marked for destruction on Guard tactical displays. The bombardment began at 0600 the next morning. I was reviewing supply manifests when the first shells fell, and even at 3 kilometers distance, the sound made my teeth ache. Not the individual explosions, those merged into a continuous roar like the earth itself was screaming, but the rhythm underneath. Every battery firing in sequence, coordinated by the Guard's artillery commanders to create a rolling barrage that walked through the outer hab blocks with mechanical precision. It continued for 16 hours. By the time the guns fell silent, the entire southern quarter of the hive was burning. Smoke rose in a column visible from orbit, turning the afternoon sky the color of old scars. The Vox channels carried nothing but static now. The heretics' broadcasting equipment presumably buried under tons of collapsed rockcrete. Infantry went in the next day. I accompanied a logistics team following the Kolvar 88th 2nd Battalion, staying well behind the actual combat elements, but close enough to see what the Guard did to cities that harbored heretics who mocked them. They didn't storm through streets in heroic charges. They didn't kick down doors and clear rooms in dramatic assaults. They simply worked. Each building was checked methodically, each room cleared according to standard procedure. When resistance was encountered, the squad would fall back, mark the position, and call in fire support. Sometimes that meant a Chimera's multi-laser, sometimes a demolition team with melter charges. For particularly stubborn positions, they'd simply call down another artillery strike. Why risk Guardsmen when you had shells? The bodies we found in those first sectors told a story. Some had died in the bombardment, crushed, burned, torn apart by shrapnel. But others had clearly died before the shells fell. Murder-suicides, ritual killings, the kind of desperate horror that happens when people realize they've damned themselves and can't see any way out. One hab block had been turned into a charnel house, Dozens of civilians butchered in what was probably meant to be some kind of sacrifice. The heretics had painted their symbols on the walls in blood, but the symbols were wrong, malformed, the desperate scratching of people who'd read forbidden texts but didn't truly understand what they'd invited in. A guard trooper, I never learned his name. He was just another flak-armored figure in a sea of them, stopped beside me while I was documenting the scene for my reports. "First time seeing what they do?" he asked. His voice was muffled by his rebreather, but I caught the flat effect, the emotional distance of someone who'd seen too many horrors to react to them anymore. "I've read the reports," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the smell. "Studied the patterns of chaos corruption. This is textbook." "Textbook," he echoed. "Sure. Textbook says people who mock the guard learn better, or they don't learn at all. This is the second option." He gestured at the carnage. "They probably thought they were winning, thought their new gods would protect them, thought we'd be too scared to come in after them." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Nobody's scared. We're just thorough." That word thorough became the defining characteristic of the campaign. The Guard wasn't conducting a liberation, wasn't attempting to save the city or reclaim it for the Imperium. They were systematically destroying it, block by block, sector by sector, with the same careful attention to detail a scribe brings to a particularly important document. Week 2 brought contact with the first organized heretic resistance. They'd fortified the central industrial sector, turned its factoriums and processing plants into defensive strongpoints. When the Guard's advance reached the perimeter, the heretics finally responded with something more than scattered las fire and improvised explosives. They had heavy weapons, some stolen from PDF armories, others that might have been gifts from whatever powers they'd pledged themselves to. They had numbers, thousands of them packed into defensive positions. They had faith, the manic certainty that their new gods would grant them victory. The Guard had artillery. For 3 days, the bombardment was continuous. The industrial sector's buildings were more robust than the outer hab blocks, reinforced to withstand the heat and pressure of manufacturing processes, so it took longer to reduce them. I processed requisition after requisition, shells, and more shells. The artillery units fired until their barrels glowed, then rotated to reserve positions while the first set cooled. The heretics tried to sally out, tried to break through the cordon, tried everything they could think of to stop the methodical destruction of their fortress. Nothing worked. Every sortie was cut down by coordinated fire. Every attempted breakout was predicted and countered before it could develop momentum. The Guard had mapped every approach, calculated every angle, prepared every response. There was no luck involved, no heroic moments, no dramatic last stands, just the grinding, inevitable application of superior firepower and discipline. When the infantry finally went in to clear the rubble, they found fewer than 800 living heretics among the ruins. Most were wounded, many were mad, all were covered in the dust and blood and chemical residue of their collapsed fortress. A few tried to fight, most just stared, their eyes already empty, their spirits broken not by fear but by the horrible realization that nothing they'd done had mattered. The powers they'd called upon had promised them strength, victory, transformation. Instead, they'd been buried alive in their own stronghold by an enemy who never even raised their voice. I stood in what had been a factorum floor, now just a crater with twisted metal beams jutting from the broken stone, and watched the Guard process the prisoners. There was no anger, no vindictiveness, no gloating, just tired soldiers doing unpleasant work with professional detachment. The prisoners were searched, disarmed, catalogued, and prepared for transport to the penal holds, where the commissariat would determine their fates. Some would die quickly, some would wish they had. A commissar I'd seen in the strategic briefings, a tall woman with silver threaded through her black hair and a scar that ran from temple to jaw, stopped beside me. "Your Munitorum," she said. "Statement, not question. Logistics coordinator, yes. I'm documenting. Good. When you write your reports, Make sure you're accurate about the timeline. 3 weeks to clear the outer sectors and industrial district. Make sure that's recorded properly. I will. May I ask, why does the timeline matter specifically? She looked at me with eyes that had probably witnessed 100 campaigns, signed 1,000 execution orders, made 10,000 impossible decisions. Because someone, somewhere, will think about mocking the Guard again. They'll hear about this campaign, read the reports, try to calculate whether the risk is worth it. They need to know that we didn't rush, didn't cut corners. We took the time to do it right, because we had the time, because we always have the time, because we're patient. Patient, I repeated. Patient. She nodded toward the crater, the ruins, the smoke still rising from a dozen fires. We can afford to be. We've been fighting for 10,000 years. We'll be fighting for 10,000 more. What's a few extra weeks to make sure the message is clear? Week 3 marked the beginning of the final phase. The heretics had retreated to the central hive spire, the massive structure that housed the city's original administration, its noble quarters, its cathedral to the god emperor. Sebastian Volk's family had owned estates in the mid-levels. I wondered if he was up there now, hiding in what had been his childhood home, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake. The spire was too massive for conventional artillery to bring down. It would have required the Navy's orbital bombardment, and Colonel Hennick wanted the heretics to see their end coming from the ground. So the Guard did what the Guard always does. They adapted their doctrine and applied maximum force within the constraints given. Siege engineers began mining operations, drilling into the bedrock beneath the spire, while combat engineers sealed every entrance and exit. The plan was simple and brutal. Plant enough explosives to collapse the spire's foundations, then bring the entire structure down in a controlled demolition. The heretics would have time to see it coming, time to understand that their fortress was about to become their tomb. It took 12 days to place the charges. I listened to the vox chatter from the engineering teams, their calm professional reports about depth and placement and yield calculations. Sometimes, late in the work cycle, we'd hear sounds from within the spire, screaming, prayer. Once, someone singing what might have been a hymn to the Emperor, though the words were wrong, twisted into something that made my skin crawl. The Guard engineers ignored it all, focused entirely on their technical task. On the 13th day, Colonel Hennick gave the order. I was in the command post when the charges detonated, but even at safe distance, the ground shook hard enough to knock supply crates off their pallets. The spire, 2 kilometers of reinforced rockcrete and steel, took approximately 40 seconds to collapse completely. It didn't topple so much as crumble, sections falling into the void created by the destroyed foundation, the whole massive structure compressing down into its own footprint. The dust cloud rose for kilometers. It took 3 hours to settle enough that we could see the results clearly. Where Volhemia Tertius's central spire had stood, there was now only rubble, a mountain of broken stone and twisted metal that had once housed thousands. How many heretics had been inside when it fell? We never got an exact count, somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000, based on intelligence estimates. How many survived the collapse? The Guard sent teams in to check. None. The final week of the campaign was cleanup. The Guard went through the ruins systematically, checking for survivors. Finding none, they catalogued the dead, marked mass graves, prepared documentation for the administratum's records. They worked with the same methodical care they'd shown throughout the campaign, treating the corpses of heretics with the same professional detachment they'd shown the living ones. I found Sebastian Volk's body on day 28. The Guard squad that pulled him from the rubble called me over because I'd distributed a list of high-priority targets to all units he'd been on it, marked for potential interrogation if recovered alive. He wasn't alive. A support beam had crushed his chest, probably within minutes of the collapse. His face was still recognizable, though still bore that noble refinement that had made his mockery sound so educated. His eyes were open. In those final seconds, watching the ceiling come down, I wondered what he'd thought. Had he called on his new gods? Had they answered? Or had he died knowing Finally, that he'd traded the Emperor's distant indifference for something far worse, that the powers he'd pledged himself to cared even less about his survival than the Imperium he'd betrayed. I never found out. The dead don't confess. But standing there, looking at his corpse being loaded onto a cart for the corpse processing units, I realized that his fate was the answer to his own question. He'd asked why the Guard were patient, why they didn't rush in. Now he knew. Because patience meant thoroughness. Thoroughness meant no survivors. No survivors meant no one left to make the same mistake twice. Colonel Hennick held a final briefing on day 30. All regimental commanders attended, along with senior logistics personnel like myself. The numbers were read out with the same flat precision that had characterized the entire campaign. 14 regiments deployed, 43 days of sustained operations, approximately 50,000 enemy combatants eliminated, Guard casualties, 812 wounded, 247 dead, 40,000 of theirs for every one of ours. The mathematics of superiority rendered in blood and broken stone, the Departamento Munitorum, Hennick said, looking directly at me, will record this campaign as a successful pacification of heretical uprising. All reports will be filed appropriately. All documentation will be thorough and accurate. Future administratum analysts reviewing this campaign should understand exactly what happened here and why. I nodded, understanding my assignment. The reports I would write would become part of the Guard's institutional memory, another data point in the vast archive of Imperial military history. Someone, centuries from now, might pull these records when planning a response to some other heretical uprising. They would see the timeline, the casualty ratios, the methodical progression from mockery to annihilation. They would understand the message. The withdrawal began the next day. 14 regiments packing up their equipment with the same careful attention to detail they'd shown in everything else. Every shell casing collected, every damaged piece of equipment catalogued, every supply shipment accounted for and reconciled against the original manifests. The Guard didn't leave messes, they left lessons. I stayed for an additional week, finalizing the logistics reports and coordinating with the administratum officials who would oversee the city's eventual reconstruction. Volhemia Tertius would be rebuilt, of course. The Imperium didn't abandon cities just because they'd fallen to heresy. They'd bring in new population, sanctify the ruins, construct new hab blocks over the graves of the old. In 50 years, no one would remember what happened here except as a footnote in local history, briefly corrupted, swiftly reclaimed. But I would remember, and everyone else who'd been here would remember, and our reports would ensure that the Guard remembered, institutionally and completely. On my last night planetside, I stood at the edge of the ruins that had been Volhemia Tertius and played the recording one final time. Sebastian Volk's young, confident voice, speaking words he couldn't possibly have understood the weight of, the Emperor's trained dogs. I listened to it through twice, then erased it from my personal storage. I didn't need it anymore. The memory was burned deep enough. I kept a copy in the official archives, though 3 minutes and 47 seconds of audio that would be filed alongside my 1,400-page report on the campaign's logistics. Future analysts would hear it, that educated voice dripping with contempt, and then they'd read what came after. They'd see the supply requisitions shells by the hundreds of thousands, ration packs by the millions, fuel and ammunition, and medical supplies in quantities that suggested not a battle, but an industrial process. They'd see the timeline 43 days of methodical destruction. They'd see the casualty ratios 40,000 to 247. They'd understand why heretics regret mocking the Guard. Not because the Guard is cruel, though they can be when duty demands it. Not because the Guard is vengeful, though they remember every slight against the Emperor they serve, but because the Guard is patient and professional and utterly thorough. Because when you mock them, you're not insulting their pride or questioning their courage. You're miscalculating. You're revealing that you don't understand what they are. They're not soldiers in the romantic sense, not warriors seeking glory or heroes chasing legends. They're the Emperor's instrument, wielded with patience and precision. They don't rush to answer insults because they don't need to. They have time. They have resources. They have 14 regiments and enough ammunition to level continents, and the calm certainty that comes from 10,000 years of grinding warfare. They have procedure. They have doctrine. They have the knowledge that every enemy they've ever faced, Xeno's horrors, chaos, abominations, traitor uprisings, has eventually learned the same lesson. You can fight the Guard, you might even win battles against them, but you cannot outlast them. You cannot out-organize them. You cannot make them afraid or uncertain or hasty. And if you mock them, if you broadcast your contempt across channels meant for the Emperor's word and call them dogs and laugh at their patience, they will teach you why patience is a virtue. They'll teach you slowly, methodically, with the same attention to detail they bring to every aspect of warfare. They'll teach you thoroughly. I left Volhemia Tertius 31 days after the campaign officially ended. My transport lifted off from the same secured landing zone where I'd arrived, rising through the smoke that still hazed the atmosphere. From altitude, the city looked like a scar on the planet's surface, a deliberate wound that would eventually heal but would never quite fade. 43 days from mockery to rubble. 40,000 dead to prove a point that should have been obvious from the start. The Imperial Guard endures. It endures mockery and insult the same way it endures artillery fire and alien invasion and the grinding horror of warfare across 1 million battlefields. It endures because it was built to endure, designed to outlast every enemy through sheer professional competence and unlimited patience. The heretics who mocked them learned this. Sebastian Volk learned it in the seconds before a support beam crushed his privileged, educated, damned life out of existence. The thousands who died alongside him learned it in their own ways, some quickly, some slowly, all too late. And somewhere, on some other world in some other sector, someone is probably broadcasting their own mockery right now, calling the Guard cowards or fools or the Emperor's trained dogs, laughing at their discipline, questioning their courage, making the same fatal miscalculation that's been made 1,000 times before. The Guard will hear it. They'll plot the coordinates. They'll load the transports. They'll gather the shells and count the rations and prepare the documentation. They'll deploy with their usual methodical care, and they'll teach the lesson again with the same thorough professionalism they've shown every time, because that's what they do. That's all they do. And they'll still be doing it long after every heretic who ever mocked them has been reduced to dust and forgotten. I think about that sometimes, late in the cycle when the work is done and the lumen strips dim. I think about Sebastian Volk's voice on that recording, so confident and contemptuous. I think about the Guard's response, not angry, not insulted, just thorough. I think about 43 days and 40,000 dead, and the mathematical precision of superiority rendered in blood and broken stone. And I understand, finally, why the Guard never rushed, why they took their time, why they did everything by manual and procedure and doctrine. Because they wanted every single heretic in that city to have time to regret, time to understand, time to learn the lesson before the lesson ended them. They're patient like that. They're the Emperor's trained dogs, after all. And they always answer the call.